Hello, my name is Elizabeth Talaga, and today I will be speaking with author Gregory Harms about his forthcoming book entitled No Politics, No Religion: How America's Code of Conduct Conceals Our Unity. Gregory is also author of other works such as Straight Power Concepts in the Middle East and It's Not About Religion. For full disclosure, I am a former student of Gregory, and we both worked together to found the University of St. Francis Philosophy Club. Greg, thanks so much for being here today. It's really great to be back on campus with you.
It's great to be here.
Well, so I think we're all dying to know, what's your book about, and can you give us a little bit of rundown on the topics that you're going to cover?
Well, it's sort of indicated in the title. No politics, no religion. This is a code of conduct, as I reference in the secondary title. It's a code of conduct that I think most of us are familiar with. We've heard this before. We've heard, your aunt at the holiday dinner table say, kind of lay down the law. There's no politics, no religion. We're supposed to treat these topics as verboten. And I've heard that for so many years. I thought about it, and I thought that's politically dangerous. I think that a population that doesn't talk to one another, I think, is in real danger. I think those are the two topics that we should be talking about.
Okay. So what type of topics are you going to cover in order to justify that argument that we don't have these conversations with one another? Are you going to look at it from a philosophical angle? Or are you going to look at it from more of a cultural angle? Like, how do you plan to cover those themes?
I start with a story that I'm quite taken with. I've been teaching philosophy for about 9 years now. And I teach a lot of ethics classes, so I spend a lot of time in the company of moral philosophy, in the company of moral philosophers. And I started focusing on the Enlightenment period. There's a list of thinkers there, from David Hume to Adam Smith to Rousseau, Joseph Butler. There's a whole list. And these guys revolutionized how we look at human morality and how we look at humans, which I found quite fascinating. I mean, they just redrew how we look at human beings. For centuries, you still hear it. For centuries, even before those guys arrived on the scene, humans were described as these nasty, competitive, greedy, sin-prone creatures. And the Enlightenment just flipped that whole narrative and just represented humanity to us and observed that we're motivated by sympathy, that we're motivated by pity, that Adam Smith says we desire not only to be loved, but to be lovely. That is, to be deserving of that love. This is at the center of who we are. We have a human nature. It stands to reason. You wouldn't expect flies to act like leopards. Every organism has its own nature. Flies have their nature, they do their thing. Leopards have a nature, they do their thing. And we have a nature. We are moral beings. And we don't see that anywhere else in the animal kingdom. You see some behavior in chimpanzees and bonobos that indicates a kind of rough, basic sense of right and wrong. But we wouldn't make the leap and say that chimpanzees and bonobos are moral agents like we are. Maybe your dog will recognize when you're off. You're having an emotional day, you have a bad day, and your dog pays you particular attention.
I know mine does.
Your dog does this. Okay, so you know what I'm talking about. So that I wouldn't say that you and your dog are necessarily on the same moral page. I don't think you and your dog are connecting on a profound level, but yeah, okay, fine. Your dog can sense that something's wrong with Elizabeth today. She seems a little off. She's having a bad day. Okay, well, there are these building blocks to our morality. To cut the story short, we can see the rough building blocks of our sense of right and wrong. So I found that fascinating. the Enlightenment, what the Enlightenment thinkers had to say. And then they get ignored for about 250 years. It's like the history of philosophy said, yeah, okay, great. And then they went right back to what they were doing. And I just find that kind of comical, that these guys revolutionized human morality and how we look at humans. And then no one seemed particularly interested. So fast forward 2.5 centuries, I started reading the work of scientists, neuroscientists, evolutionary biologists, archaeologists, psychologists. There's fascinating work being done on babies and infants at Yale. What do these works all have in common? Well, I read one after another, and I have been at this for years. And as soon as the box shows up from Amazon, I take the book out of the box. There's a procedure, I take the book out of the box. I flip to the index and I look for Hume and Smith, and they're in there almost 100% of the time. So I thought, that's fascinating. And then they mentioned David Hume and Adam Smith in the books. And this kept happening. I'd buy a new book on moral psychology, or, some archaeologist makes some observation about human beings and human morality, or, some philosopher does a book on neuroscience and looking at brain chemistry. And they almost 100% of them tip their hats to Adam Smith and David Hume. And I just thought that was astounding. I'm like, these guys got ignored for 200 years, and now they're the talk of the town. And all these scientists are saying, yep, Hume was on the right track, Adam Smith was on the right track, Rousseau was on the right track. These guys are being validated in the world of science.
And how do you see that playing out with the political sphere in America?
So this tells us something. This tells us that we have a lot in common. This tells us that we are not nasty creatures. We are not sinful, competitive, aggressive creatures, that we are motivated, like I said earlier, motivated by sympathy and pity. And then science, like I said, is bearing this out. And this tells us that we have an enormous amount in common. And I think that's where we should start the conversation. When we talk, when Aunt so-and-so lays down the law about no politics and no religion at the Thanksgiving table, I can't say I blame her, because she doesn't want to listen to your uncles bicker. And quite frankly, I don't either. But I think the problem is that the reason your uncles are bickering across the mashed potatoes is because they start where they disagree. I watch CNN, this guy watches Fox, and then we get into an argument, which I think is absurd. I think we can have a constructive, rational conversation about these topics. I do in my classes. I've been doing it for most of a decade. And I have yet to have a student blow a gasket and lose their cool and get mad and storm out of the room. It's never happened. We talk about politics and religion up one side and down the other. And we do it constructively, and we start, as one should, with where we agree. And we look at the public opinion polling, and it tells us what, focusing on Americans, that's where we are. We know precisely what Americans want. The public opinion record is rich and redundant, and we know everything about what we want, what we don't want, what strikes fear in our hearts, and so on. So if we attend to the public opinion record and start the conversation with where we agree, we find that there is an enormous amount of agreement among Americans. And we're bombarded with the opposite messaging, that we're a nation divided, that Americans can't even agree on what color the sky is, and so on and so forth, and the country's about to tear itself apart. And then we use this supplied vocabulary of liberal and conservative, which is quite unfortunate, because that polarizes our thinking. Mm-hmm. They become jerseys. One uncle's a liberal and your other uncle's a conservative, and then they engage in bickering, instead of starting the conversation in a constructive way.
Yeah, absolutely. I know my family is always like that, especially around the holidays.
I mentioned this I've mentioned in front of, I couldn't even tell you how many students, and they all have that story. Like, oh my God, my family, like Uncle so-and-so just loses his cool and starts yelling about this, that, and the next thing. I mean, they all have that story. Mm-hmm. This is a very common tale that's told.
Yeah. Well, I think all Americans have that story. So it sounds like your potential audience in this book is extremely wide. Who do you see your target audience as being?
Well, I've written the book for a general adult readership. I know that's kind of casting a super wide net, but I think anyone who votes, anyone who is interested in these topics, and that's something I'd like to touch upon. I get a lot of students that are like, I don't follow politics, I'm not interested. They've been taught to not want to touch it with a 10-foot pole.
Well, it's easier to dissociate.
Right. It's easier to disconnect and just like, okay, that's my uncle's and I don't want to sound like my uncle, so I'm going to stay away from it, But once I start in the classroom explaining these concepts, what does liberal mean? What is liberalism? What is conservatism? We look at the public opinion polls, like I said, and when they start to gain even a rough familiarity, I've seen this on hundreds of occasions, they start becoming interested, lo and behold. They're like, oh, wait, this isn't this scary, angry topic I've been taught that it was. And then they discover, wait, I have something to say about this. And they find their own voice. Mm-hmm. With just a slight nudge and the minimum of vocabulary. And I've watched students right in front of my eyes. You see it click. You're like, oh, this isn't scary at all. And I do have something to say. I think that's remarkable. And so I guess, to go back to your question, if I have a hope, it would be that even people who aren't interested, I hope they start turning pages in the book and find their voice and find that they have something to say on the matter. That's the most I could hope for.
Yeah, that's incredible. It sounds like it's kind of almost like a love letter to your students. Like, I know that you always mention that you're teaching the next generation of American leaders. So it sounds like you're kind of fostering this environment where it's safe to talk about these things and to have kind of a controlled conflict, almost like conflict in the most academic sense that there is.
Right. Yeah, right.
Academic discourse. So being a former student of yours, I know that these topics are things that you've been meditating on for quite some time. How do you think that teaching has actually impacted your perspective? Do you think that students have shaped your view on this topic at all? Because obviously you're making an impact on them. How does it go the other way?
I think the younger generations, Generation Z and the millennials, have been done a tremendous disservice. I see them at their best. Okay. Now, maybe someone would level a criticism at me and say, well, you see them in a controlled environment and, you do see them at their best. How about when they're at their worst? Well, I don't have access to their personal lives. I see them in a controlled environment, like laboratory conditions. And I don't think that's a bad way to start, to examine someone, to look at someone, to make observations. And I find Generation Z and the millennials years ago, I haven't taught millennials for quite a while, I find them to be open-minded and receptive to different ways of thinking, and they're not afraid to engage in analytical criticism of things that the older generations just hold as sacrosanct. You know, there are certain topics that we're just not allowed to, you know, they're verboten. We're supposed to just speak with praise about certain concepts. And I have found the younger generations to be remarkably open-minded and receptive. I think that's one of the principal things I've learned by talking to them, is they've shown me how open-minded they are about other people, about other cultures, about other races. I mean, it's not my favorite concept, but different races. They just seem across the board more open-minded. And that gives me tremendous hope for the future. I know that sounds kind of trite, but if I look at the young people in this country, and I'm in their company 5 days a week, it's inspirational. I see cause for hope and optimism. If my observations have been correct, and I see it every day. So they give me a lot of hope, which we could use. Yeah.
Very much so. Speaking of open-mindedness, I was very interested to see that this book is focusing on domestic policy, because from what I understand, your previous work focuses almost exclusively on Middle Eastern politics and U.S. foreign policy. So why the switch now? What has inspired you to make the change to American politics?
I think it's just time spent. I mean, you know, not so many years ago, that was all I focused on, was U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. Made a number of trips to the region. I mean, that's just where my head was. But after teaching now for, like I said, almost 10 years now, I think I'm nine deep now. That's just where I've been spending my time. And when I happened upon this narrative from the Enlightenment to science, I just thought, that story needs to be told. People should know about that. Plus, when we add the political implications, I mean, there's a political story there too. Mm-hmm. It's not just an intellectual sort of interest I have. I saw what was going on in the Enlightenment. I've been observing what's going on in science. And then I thought, that's a political story. And I think it's one that needs to be told. I think that's really important, because we're just liberal and conservative. How do I turn those into gerunds, into ings? We're terming ourselves to death. We've gone down this blind alley, and we've like I mentioned earlier, we've polarized. We've become quite polarized. I wouldn't say the nation's divided, but I would say our thinking has become quite polarized. We think in terms of everything has to be stamped. You can't even utter a sentence in this country about politics without someone within earshot stamping you a liberal or a conservative. And I think that's quite dangerous. And I think that this new subject matter I'm focusing on, with the political philosophy and science and politics, I think it's a way out of that. I think it offers a solution. I think we are our worst enemies when it comes to this stuff, you know. Yeah, we need to be more like Generation Z.
So in telling this story, what kind of outcomes are you hoping for your readers? Are you hoping to affect the way that people vote or their willingness to vote? Are you hoping to just give people a toolbox in order to have these conversations? What do you want your readers to walk away with after they finish your book?
Well, I've told probably hundreds of students You don't have to use those words, liberal and conservative. You don't have to use them. You can just dispense with them. You can just use your own language and talk about what you politically want. Frame this stuff in your own language. And so I think if I had a hope for for readers, it would be that they would start to use their own language. Talk about what you want. Talk about what you don't want. And then compare where you stand to candidate A, B, or C. Does this candidate approximate my views? Which candidate comes closer to where I stand? You don't need to rubber stamp everything liberal and conservative. So I think that would be a hope for people to use their own language and vote. Voting wouldn't hurt. I mean, really. I've had countless students say, "I don't vote. I'm not interested." Then I mention it's a very easy statistic. It's not even a statistic. It's just the numbers. In 2016, roughly 60 million people voted for Hillary Clinton, and roughly 60 million people voted for Donald Trump. And roughly 100 million people stayed home. That's not a healthy democracy. 100 million people stayed home? Mm-hmm. I just find that's flooring, So yeah, vote. Go to the polls, yeah.
So in essence, would you say that this is a book about showing up, about the power of showing up, engaging in discourse, actually participating in our democratic system?
I think it's about the power of thinking your own thoughts and using your own language, primarily. I think it's about claiming ownership and authorship of what's in your head. And that's a lot of power. Mm-hmm. If you can frame things in your own language and achieve the confidence that comes with that offers a kind of confidence. You can see the world more clearly and use your own language, and you have faith in your own language to articulate these thoughts and to express yourself politically. That there's a confidence that I tell my students, I hope all of you experience that. I think that's what it's about. Yeah.
Very powerful. What would you say your favorite section of the book was? What did you enjoy writing the most?
Well, a former professor of mine, former mentor. Are they ever former? I don't. Maybe.
I mean, you're not, so.
Maybe former.
So no.
Maybe former is not the right word, but he said philosophy. He told me this 25, 30 years ago. Philosophy is a calling, and I think that's correct. I know this sounds kind of hippie, but I mean, it did kind of find me. I know that. I know what that sounds like, but I can't help it. I really enjoyed going through the Enlightenment philosophy. I really did. I like writing about those things. I thought it was a lot of fun. And I liked writing about Thomas Hobbes. Because everybody gets Hobbes wrong. It's remarkable, the number of thinkers that you bump into in philosophy. Friedrich Nietzsche, with whom you're familiar. Karl Marx, there's another one. He's probably at the top of the list. There are all these thinkers that people have all these opinions about, but they're a mile off because they don't read them. You just go on what you've heard. You've been told things about Karl Marx, so okay, we'll just go with that. There's a lot of opinions about Nietzsche, so we'll just go with those opinions. It's easier than reading books. So Hobbes is another one where people, like, oh, he says people are naturally nasty and evil and prone to tearing one another limb from limb. He doesn't say that. He doesn't, in Leviathan, his masterpiece. He doesn't say anything remotely like that. He even comes out and says clearly, I'm not condemning human nature. He even comes out and he says it out loud in very clear English that I'm not condemning human nature in my analysis. And yet, not everyone, but a lot of people attribute that to him. So it was fun to kind of set that record straight.
Yeah, I love that. It sounds like you're doing a little bit of corrective before you do directive.
Yeah, I think so. I think, boy, when you're talking about philosophers, you have to do that, don't you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You have to kind of set the record straight, before you charge in, mm-hmm. Right? Yeah, that's well put. Yes.
It sounds like the book is incredibly timely. I know I'm very excited to read it before the midterm elections, going into the next presidential election in a few years, and to have these conversations with my own family. I think it'll be really interesting to be able to use your book to foster such conversations. So thank you so much for discussing the book with us. It's been a pleasure to have you, and really excited to see how it performs in the market.
Thank you.